Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Jan Holden, a professor emerita of counseling from the University of North Texas, and serving currently as president of the International Association for Near-Death Study. And with me today is Alexander Batthyány, Alex.
Hello.
And Alex holds the chair in theoretical psychology at Pázmány University in Budapest, and has written the first English book on the phenomenon of terminal lucidity. Before you wrote this book, a few years ago, a psychologist in Germany, Michael Nahm, wrote a book in German, but it wasn't translated into English, so it's really been inaccessible to people who don't speak German. And so your book, I think, is really groundbreaking because it's going to reach a much wider audience. So tell us, I guess, is there anything else you want us to know about you, your background, or anything, or you want to jump right into the subject?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's nice to see you. And I'm glad to share the time with you and our audience and viewers. And whatever will come up, will come up. So I think that's fine for a start, as you wish. I mean.
Good. Okay, that sounds great. Well, why don't you start by telling everyone what terminal lucidity actually is?
Right. So the term consists of two words: terminal, which means towards the end of life in this case, and lucidity refers to a clear mind, a clear consciousness, a awareness of who you are and what is your biography. In other words, you have access to memory and you can interact with your environment. In other words, you can communicate and you can, sense and share what you've experienced. And why is it a strange phenomenon? Because we observe this and study this in cases of persons who have been severely cognitively impaired before they have such an episode. In other words, patients who had Alzheimer's, or who have actually Alzheimer's, and there are many different frontotemporal dementia, there are many different types of brain diseases which lead to severe cognitive impairment. How does it look like? People who don't react, who don't even recognize their own son and daughters or grandchildren. It's a sad disease, and unfortunately, it's a very prevalent disease. Many people do have it, or have relatives who have it. But we also find it with patients who had strokes and are severely impaired. Some strokes can be really severe depending on where they happen in the brain, in which areas are affected by it. People who had bacterial meningitis, which also in some cases leads one chronically impaired, and other diseases. And so there used to be another term, paradoxical lucidity, and it's still around. And I think it's also good, it should be called paradoxical terminal lucidity, because when one has such a brain disease, a remission, in other words, healing, is out of question. It doesn't occur in the textbook. It just doesn't happen. It would be a bit like unboiling a cooked egg. It would be a miracle. And yet this miracle does take place in what seems to be a rare and yet sizable number of people, around 10%, who, when they come close to death and dying, let's say anything between, in our studies, it's between 3 days and a few minutes, that suddenly they wake up. And suddenly, what usually happens is that the nursing home calls and says, the physiological parameters are going downwards, this patient is going to die. So family comes, doesn't expect to gain much, but to give a lot, to say farewell to a loved one and so on, final hours and minutes. But when they enter the room, the patient looks at them, calls them their name, says hello, whatever, and usually it's a very moving final. First comes the shock, because nobody expects this. No medical doctor would have predicted that, your patient will come back, and yet it does happen. and then their share lasts, it depends on, it could be minutes, it can be hours. I think the longest case I do have is about 40 hours, which is quite a long time. And then I think now we have to say what happened and what happens. Now that people know about it, it goes a different way. But usually what happened was that relatives stayed as long as they could, but then visiting hours closed, or the patient, grew tired and fell asleep. And one wonders what will happen now. Is he or she, the doctors called us to tell us that he's going to die, and yet what we see is a healthy person. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what will happen? But usually, in most of the cases, within a few days, sometimes hours, the hospital, nursing home, hospice will call and say, "We're sorry to say, but he or she died, overnight or in the early morning hours," and so on. So this is what happens. There's also a formal definition. I can read it to you. In 2018, the National Institute on Aging of the NIH had an expert workshop. We were about, I think, 9 people, Bruce Grayson among them, and other colleagues from neuroscience, psychology, different fields. There are many fields involved in this. Yeah. Linguistics, so how do people talk, and so on. And we had the great task, because rarely in your scientific career do you have a chance to define a phenomenon. Yeah, so it was a wonderful gift. And we came up with this. It's an episode of unexpected. In other words, you wouldn't predict it from the brain state of the patient. Spontaneous. There seems to be no trigger other than the fact that this patient is going to die. Yeah. Meaningful and relevant communication or connectedness in the patient who is assumed to have permanently lost the capacity for any of that. Yeah. And this is basically what we observe and study.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And my guess is that maybe in some cases in the past, people thought that, oh, the patient is back. Maybe this means that they're like recovering or that sort of thing. And now there's a better understanding that that this is a temporary condition that usually foretells the patient's death.
I have to be, and I am very cautious, and that's a huge responsibility. So often, now that, several media outlets reported about our work, our interest in this, I receive emails and somebody's telling me, look, right now, my granddad is back. And it's just a joy, but will it be a heartbreak too? Because will he die? Yeah. And the honest answer would be, we don't know. Yeah. Because even statistics, what is statistics compared to the patient or the granddad before you? Yeah. So he might be we don't know. I should say that in my case collection, a vast majority of 90% or even 95% do die within a few days. Yeah. But still, yours could be the 5%. We never know. There's a huge difference between what the numbers say and what your experience tells us. Yeah. That's where the beauty of life actually takes place. Yeah. Namely, you move from figures to experience. But still, the figures are important, and they tell us that it's terminal. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And how many cases do you have now? How many cases have you collected?
It's growing and growing, because now that the book has been published, even more so. Maybe I think 393. Maybe it's even close. Sometimes I can't even keep up, with But it's about. I do have a special folder in my mailbox where the cases go, but there's so much to do in everyday life. I've got 2 teenage daughters, just imagine, and many students, just imagine how busy. So I can't keep up. But still, I try to reply everyone. Yeah, that's a promise I made. Sometimes it takes far too long, but still I thank everyone and try to relish and acknowledge what they send to me. It's an enormous trust, no? Yeah. And you have to honor this too. And not only you have to, you would like to. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I can tell that even though you're a researcher and you're very focused on empirical evidence, you're also very humanistic and very much connected to people on a human level. And that's a wonderful combination.
Thank you. I try. But in this field, if you're only into numbers, you're in the wrong field.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So true. So you did mention paradoxical lucidity. Can you clarify the relationship between what paradoxical lucidity, I gather, means the paradoxical, meaning like the unexpected or
Right.
counter to what you'd expect, return of consciousness of lucid functioning.
Right. Yeah.
That could happen maybe anytime. Like I remember seeing a movie one time about Alzheimer's where the woman who had the disease seemed occasionally to come back and be
Wow.
present and then recede back into the disease.
Yes.
Was that just fiction or does that happen?
I mean, it depends on which stage. Alzheimer's, as most dementias, are progressive diseases. In other words, they get worse, unfortunately. We can slow down a little tiny bit, but not very much. Yeah. And in the early stages, you still have this waxing and waning symptoms. So it comes and goes and so on. The further the patient goes into the dementia, the less likely and the less will one notice the waxing and waning, because the ceiling is very low. Yeah. And even if he or she is better than usual, maybe that means that he or she once reacts to the name when you call her by name. Also, but there are cases of paradoxical lucidity. In other words, there are very unexpected cases, in the sense that even someone with advanced Alzheimer's seems to be suddenly surprises you by saying something utterly beautiful or very concrete, connected to the outside world. And it's as understudied as is terminal lucidity. Yeah. So we don't know very much about it. Yeah.
Okay.
And the problem is, it also happened, all these things happen in a very, very busy everyday life in the nursing home or in the hospital, for example. And people are running around. These nurses are doing such an enormous work. Yeah? And nobody, or very few people, say thank you. The patients usually don't, because they're not in the right mind at the moment. Yeah. And I sometimes wonder, how often do we miss such episodes? Yeah. Terminal or not terminal, but and so it's very hard to say. It's understudied, and our task as researchers also, I mean, there are many tasks involved, but also is to make people aware that this can happen. So that they, if you observe your patient suddenly thanking you that you opened the window, then you should turn around and sit a little longer at his or her bed. Maybe he will tell you even more than that.
Yeah. Okay, really interesting. So how did you come to focus on this research?
Well, there are several reasons. I had the enormous fortune of having 3 academic mentors, or I could listen to their lectures and I could even talk to them, like Sir John C. Eccles, who was a famous neurologist and Nobel Prize laureate.
Yeah.
And I wrote my thesis on his work. Yeah. And in this context, he granted me a very lengthy interview, which I recorded, which I also quote in the book, or at least a very important passage. And he actually was a dualist. In other words, he believed what many people, I think, in the near-death community do think, or seem to have knowledge of, that our minds, our self, and our brains are not identical, and neither is the self merely a function or product of brain function. Yeah. So, and this happened we talked, I think, in 1996 or so, 1 year before he died. And the other teacher, and I'm still very much in this field, is Viktor Frankl, famous for Man's Search for Meaning. But not only that, he had a clear idea, especially after seeing euthanasia, the so-called euthanasia movement of the Nazis, and being a Holocaust survivor. He hammered it on students. I listened to his last lectures, that we are, whatever disease you see behind this, there's a whole person which never became sick, which will never become sick, and not even touched by death. But that's another topic. And the third was Kübler-Ross, who mentioned this also, that she didn't look into terminal lucidity, but she's mentioned sometimes that some of her she had mainly cancer patients, but some of them were also brain cancer patients, that some of them seemed to be very vital, very much in life, at the least moment when you expect it, namely when they're dying, So this I had in my mind when my grandmother, who had a couple of strokes and was what we call vascular dementia. In other words, it's not really dementia, but it's a secondary result of having a heart disorder. And she lived in Geneva. I grew up half in Geneva and half in the rest of Europe, in many places. And one day I was a student in Vienna. My mother calls me and says, call grandma, call her quickly, because we talked and she's back. Now, we talked meant quite a thing, because for the past 6 months or so, or maybe even a year, she didn't talk. And if she talked, she only repeated what you said. So it was severe impairment. So I call my grandmother and I listen. And when she picks up the phone, and she's just extremely gentle, soft, and very kind and very elegant in a way person she always used to be. And I didn't know what's happening, of course. Nobody. When it happens, you're not, as so often when you receive an enormous gift, you're unprepared. And maybe that's part of its beauty. And life is unpredictable anyway. But we talk, and I'm so glad that I had the sense of saying, thank you for being such a wonderful grandmother, and we had beautiful days in Geneva at the Geneva Lake and so on. And she thanks me for being such a nice grandson. I doubt it, but anyway, and my brother. And we had a very nice, beautiful conversation. And at a certain point, I had no idea that this could happen. I was a student, so I actually learned how dependent the brain is and the mind is on the brain. That's what I learned at university, at the very days this happened. But at a certain point, I sensed, and I now believe that we both knew that this was to be our last conversation. And it indeed was. She died, I don't know exactly when, but briefly after that. So, and this I had in my mind as a background knowledge, so to speak. And then in 2009, it happened that 3 papers, independently of each other, were published in scientific journals. I think one in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, one in palliative care, and in different journals, on terminal lucidity. 2 of them by Michael Nahm, one with Michael and Bruce Grayson, and the other one by Sandy McLeod, who is in New Zealand, who did a prospective study, which is the gold standard for studies. So he followed 100 consecutive deaths, and to see how many of these patients experienced what he called lightening up before death. And he found 6 out of 100, which is 6%, which is, as I said, it's a sizable number. It's not a rare event. And so when I read these papers, suddenly a lot of the things which I learned from Frankl, Eccles, and Kübler-Ross made sense. But even more so, what I experienced with my grandmother made even more sense. So, and this happened at the end of the term. I was already a professor then at university. And the poor students are so overwhelmed at the end of the term with having what they have, as a professor, what they have to learn. So I usually use the last bits and units of the lectures in term to talk about things that they don't have to learn, that they are just interesting. And I shared with them. And the very same afternoon, we founded our working group on the topic, and we started a research project.
Wow.
Yeah, it was so interesting. Of course, the students immediately sensed that something is going on here on many different layers. Medically, it could be one day, if we can show that a remission is possible, maybe you can get it without the patient dying, And the second one is, of course, philosophical. What does it mean? How is it possible, even thinkable, that we have a functioning mind in concert or in parallel to a severely disordered brain? I mean, that's what's happening. We don't know.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful. Well,
Mm.
I want to get into that more, but before we do, I wonder if you could just tell us, you told us about your grandmother, one or two other cases that come to mind that illustrate maybe the variations that can occur in
I
the
mean,
function.
I have a few cases I
Okay.
thought you would ask, but
Mhm.
and you just I can let just see. Yeah,
You're welcome to
I will give you
share as
three.
many as you like.
I will give you three different ones because one is a bit longer, but the other ones are shorter because they also give us a sense of the, so often you are a professor, you know what I'm talking about. When we write textbooks, we make the ideal world, which is never, the world is even more ideal if you want, because there's so much going on. But anyway, this one comes from Switzerland. One of my first cases also from Switzerland. The first study we did was in German-speaking countries. So Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. And then we expanded it for the larger study to worldwide, at least to English-speaking, French, and Italian-speaking countries. So I read it from the letter because this is a granddaughter writing about her grandmother. Yeah. So my grandma had suffered from Alzheimer's dementia for several years, so it was advanced. Yeah. In the final stages of her illness, nothing much seemed to remain of the grandmother I knew and loved. At first, she could no longer recognize us. Eventually, she stopped speaking altogether and had to be fed because she was no longer able to feed unaided, yeah, which is at the final stages of Alzheimer what you find.
Yeah.
So my grandfather nonetheless visited her every day. Our family went to see my grandmother every Sunday, and truth be told, we didn't so much visit her, but support my grandfather on those Sundays. Beautiful family, by the way. On the way, the miracle happened, and she uses the term miracle. We reached the door, knocked, entered the room, and saw how my grandfather lovingly held my grandmother's hand, and yes, he spoke to her. At first, we just didn't trust our eyes and ears. But then my grandmother looked at us one by one, all the five of us. Her large, beautiful eyes were perfectly clear. The haze of oblivion, of apathy, the dead gaze had given way to an expression of limpid vitality, like bright water. I can't think of a better image. She, who hadn't recognized us for a year, who hadn't even reacted when we visited her, addressed every one of us by name. She who'd removed her hand when we wanted to take it, presumably on reflex. On that day, however, my grandmother said in plain, clear German that she was glad to be back and to see us. So we have this very often, that patients are aware of the facts. Also my grandmother, she said, I have been tired for a few months, very, very tired. So there's even awareness of being, yeah. Anyway, then she looked lovingly at her husband, my grandfather, and asked us to take good care of him. She said it was no good him being alone in the big house. And then she says he lived in a large house she had from her childhood, yeah, and that he needed domestic help. When we said that we had recently hired a housekeeper, she simply said, yes, but you should have told me. And the granddaughter writes, we hadn't done so because talking to, let alone with her, only a day before that would have been unthinkable. However, now she clearly understood and was reassured. She took his hand. I saw my grandfather's face. Thick tears were running down his cheeks. Between sobs, he barely managed to say, I love you. And she answered, I love you. And her gaze, I myself weep as I write this down because I can see clearly the clarity, the urgency, and love her eyes expressed that day, as clearly as I could see them now. The conversation lasted some 20 or 30 minutes. Then my grandmother lay back and soon fell asleep. We stayed at her bedside until the end of visiting time. None of us talked when we left. My grandfather linked arms with me as we walked out, but he tore away from me after a few meters and turned back in the corridor of the nursing home because he wanted to kiss his wife once more. It was to be the last time. The phone rang the next morning, And I knew before picking up what the ward nurse was going to tell us. My grandmother had died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 86. It is one of the most beautiful and wondrous and moving things I've witnessed to this day. Yeah. So this is what happens.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
touching. I
It
mean,
is.
so many times during your reading, I just got chills,
Mm.
empathizing with what that must have meant for that family and for
Yes.
her.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What an
Yeah.
amazing thing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I mean, I've got another one. We can talk. I can read whatever you want.
Well, if you think that sharing another one or two cases might help the audience get a fuller sense.
Yeah, so maybe, yeah, that's a good idea. So this one is the reports are very different. I mean, just to tell the methodology we used, in the beginning, it was only surveys, the questions, how old, how was a typical day before the lucid episode, and so on and so forth. Very, very technical, very data-like, yeah. And then this letter arrived, or just read to you, yeah. And this wonderful lady wrote, I wanted you to know what really happened.
Yeah.
And the numbers alone are not, what is it? It's age, disease, something very unlikely happens. And that's it.
Doesn't tell the meaningful aspect of the story.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, as someone who is a scientist, but also a human being, of course, you're torn between. So I decided, forget about the number. We collect the numbers because they're important. They're very informative when it comes to research. But I invited our participants, please let me know what really happened. Yeah. So in the reports, some of them were very, very long, some of them were very short. Now come a shorter one, patient 77, advanced dementia, nursing home. And that's my summary of what happened before. Now, the daughter comes, visits her mother who has dementia, and it finds her very much awake. And again, the daughter wasn't recognized for quite a while. Now she calls her, she recognizes, they just have a name. And the daughter continues to write. She was once again in her right mind, her old self. Her old self. So many, they didn't talk to each other. I mean, people are, miles apart, and even on continents sometimes. Very often you hear the old self re-emerging once again. Yeah. Mm-hmm. She recognized me and the nurses and the doctor. It was unbelievable. She had been gone for years. I was in turmoil whenever I visited her. It was so painful. I will never forget the day I had to introduce myself. It was the most painful day in my life. My mother, who had been a mother through and through, no longer recognized her own daughter, but now she did. And when I started to cry, she said, no, that is not the way. Come here. Very wise, no? And she took my hand, and we had the most wonderful last conversation. Now there come some private issues, and the mother turned out to be a very, very good advice counselor, everyone. After an hour, she said that she was tired. She looked at me, literally pouring out her love. She then slowly shook her head and then softly nodded. I nodded too, and then she closed her eyes. I left the room, and as soon as I closed the door, I broke out in tears, both of joy and of sadness. I somehow knew that this would be our last time together. She died the very same evening. Yeah. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. And another one which I like to mention because it touches upon a subject which sometimes occurs not in a majority of my studies, of my cases, but it does occur that people seem to see someone who has been dead also for quite a while. So they what we call what ancient old literature, SPR literature, calls deathbed visions. In other words, people have visiting experiences. Funnily enough, or maybe not funnily enough, but I have no case where somebody has been visited by a living person, but only by dead persons. Yeah. So my dad was in a nursing home for half a year. He had severe dementia, was doubly incontinent, could no longer formulate a sentence, didn't recognize us. So on the day he died, I expected him to be as he had been for the past 6 months. But when I entered his room, he knew exactly who I was and started talking. He looked at me and said that he knew that he would not be much longer in this home. I was not sure what he meant, or whether he thought he was healed and therefore wanted out to his flat, move to his flat again. But he shook his head. He said, "Last night David came and said he would take me home." David was his older brother. He had died only 4 weeks before. We had told my dad once, but never mentioned it again, as we were sure that he did not understand it. Yeah. When Dad talked about his beloved David, I bit my lips so that I didn't cry right there and then. But Dad looked so happy, so joyous. He really looked forward to leaving the nursing home, and he died the very same night. Yeah. So, and so on and so forth. Once again, 380 or 390 cases, but
yes,
yeah.
yes. And I might at this point say that people who are interested in this subject, you have many more cases in the book. So if they want to read more cases, I mean, each one is, I just found so touching and so revelatory about the nature of the phenomenon. It was,
Yes.
it's really a wonderful book. So,
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. So now on to that question about the nature of human consciousness. It really does seem like what terminal lucidity suggests to us is that there is this self behind the disease that is that continues and is somehow hidden by the disease, but can once again be revealed through terminal lucidity. And which, I mean, what does that mean to you about, I guess, just what do you see as the implications of that?
I'm very cautious in saying, for example, I mean, there are many books around also in the NDE field, which is fine. It's not a criticism. It's only what I cannot bring myself to say. Sometimes the word proof and so on is used a bit prematurely because proof has a very certain definition, and I'm still a scientist, yeah, and therefore I can't just say. But what we do have is evidence, and that's quite a lot also, yeah, and you know what is important to say anyway. I will answer your question, but it's a brief tour. The phenomenon has been reported ever since people took care of people. Yeah, in other words, it's as old as humanity when it became humane, which is quite a long time. Yeah, and in earlier times, like in ancient India, you find reports. In ancient Persia, in Africa, in every different culture. In the meanwhile, I received so many emails from doctors or medical historians telling me this has a name, and then it's some Sanskrit word or Persian word, and the last large group to look at this were the Victorian doctors. Now, all of these cultures had a clear understanding. For them, it wasn't so much a mystery as it was evidence of something they knew or they believed all along. Yeah, namely, like in ancient India, that there's the Atman, the true self, which will never become ill, which never became ill, which was never born, and which will never die. Yeah, for the Victorian doctors, who were mainly Christians, it was clear that the soul is released from the prison of the body, and so on. And it is, of course, nowadays we live in a fairly secular society. Yeah, it's I think most people would be at loss of a concept what is happening unless you look back to people like John C. Eccles or Richard Swinburne. I mean, there's a strong dualist tradition even in contemporary proper academics, if you want. Yeah, it's not as loud perhaps as materialism, but it's there. Yeah, and there are not a few. There are many of them. Yeah, also idealists and so on.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, one thing seems to be for sure, blunt materialism, which is basically saying that we are either what our brain does or we are our brain. So it's identity theory or blunt materialism is out of the question, because we know for sure that neurons don't grow back so fast. And even if they would need to grow in a very orderly fashion, otherwise it would be just a brain tumor. No, it's also a cell, but the cells are doing the wrong things. And so and given that there's so many disorders, strokes, different types of dementias, that we would need very different healing mechanisms, once again unobserved, yeah, because different areas of the brain are differently affected on different levels, cellular and so on. So yes, what do I think? I believe our subjects, and that's the people who are informing us. Yeah, there is something which is indestructible in us. Yeah, and it's the wrong wording. It's not in us; it's us. Yeah, it's what really counts. Yeah, and that seems to
like the essence of us is indestructible.
What I find so remarkable is that it's not an abstract self which reemerges. It's the self which was once born and gained a lot of experiences during this lifetime and seems to take all of it with it. You know, it's not that, you see what I'm saying? Yeah. And that's where I think this is one of the two overlaps to the near-death experience, which also, at least the interesting number which takes place during very unlikely times, speaking from the perspective of neuroscience in the brain. Yeah. So when there's a flat EEG, there's still some functioning, but the higher functions, which would be needed for these very complex experiences, is not there. At least it's hypofunctional. It's working less than it should. Yeah. And yet these people tell us, I was more awake than ever before, and life seems like a dream, and death seems like life, and so on. You hear this so often. I mean, we're used to this by now, but I mean, just think of it, yeah. And something must be so meaningful, not only about ourselves, but also our development throughout a lifetime, that it is not falling into oblivion, it's not falling into nothingness. Yeah, it can re-emerge, and it re-emerges also in the NDE, because the NDEs tell us that they remember things that they thought they were totally forgotten. Maybe they believed it is too unimportant, but then it turns out nothing is unimportant. Yeah, because every day, I mean, every word we send out, you know, has a ripple effect. It affects other people. Even the words we don't say when we should say something, it can hurt other people. Yeah, and this seems to be the message of Terminal Lucidity. As far as I'm concerned, this is what I think it really clearly points towards. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is a kind of a small aspect of what you've just been talking about, which is very big. But I believe there are cases in terminal lucidity where when the person regained lucidity, they reported things that had been told to them while they were, under the influence of the disease, and that which suggests that that even if people don't seem to understand, they may actually, that essential self may be getting the information. What do you think?
Yes, we have some of such cases. I don't report them in the book because we don't have enough of them.
Oh.
And I think there's a huge responsibility one has as a researcher, as a writer, as an author, because not only people who are interested in such topics read these books, but people who are directly affected, either because they are in early stage of dementia or because they take care of someone they love and who is afflicted by the disease. And therefore, I only try to report phenomena which we have substantial numbers, because that means it's a bit more than a mere anecdote. Yeah, but I do have a few cases. You know, some of these very heartwarming, good doctors sometimes tell people, if your whatever relative, family member, friend is in coma or unconscious, be there as if he or she noticed you. It helps.
Mhm.
There's something about, it's a bit like in bereavement counseling. The love you have for a person doesn't die with that person. And the only thing you can encourage is the love, because the love, the bitter side of it is that you feel the loss and you earn to see him or her again. Yeah. But if you know that it's the other side of the coin, and the other side is even more beautiful, it's love. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in such cases, when doctors encouraged the relative to still talk to the patient, even he or she didn't even recognize you or just stared, then sometimes they report back things that they were told during the time when they were seemingly unavailable, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah. So even though you don't have enough cases to say that this definitely is a phenomenon, it seems to me that there's enough indication there that, like those doctors suggest, if I'm a caretaker, I have nothing to lose to relate to my disabled person, my loved one, to relate to them in this way, making the assumption that at some level they know I'm there, that they can understand what I'm saying, and even though I'm not getting any feedback that that's the case, I have nothing to lose to take that approach, because they might be hearing, and if they aren't, oh well, it was just a lost to the universe sort of thing. But conversely, if I don't relate that way, it's possible that I may have missed an opportunity for something that makes for a meaningful connection at the moment, later, or whatever. Yeah.
And needed to be said. I mean, like asking for forgiveness or giving forgiveness or thanking someone. Yeah. I mean, you speak about the universe and it's not lost, because anyway, so that's my conviction also. Yeah. And I mean, we say thank you we should say it much more often. Yeah. And same goes for forgiving and being forgiven. And that's I totally agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And once again, the footnote to this would be that we do have some cases which to me strongly, but the data say slightly, suggest that it's really not lost. It arrives where it should arrive. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. So anything else that you want to say about the implications of all this for meaning and purpose in human life on Earth?
I mean, I find it so, once again, I entered this from the perspective of somebody who being a student of Viktor Frankl and Eccles and Kübler. So I always had the idea that there must be something about us which isn't mere matter, even though it's beautiful matter. It's a beautiful machinery, our brain. Even the materialist is confronted with awe and beauty, because this brain, if you look at it, it's really something. It's the most complex system in the universe we know of. Yeah. And but it was indeed the fact that it's not only the self, but the self with something, that that our biographies, what we did and what we do, makes such a difference. And if you look at it from this perspective, it's nice to hear this, but there comes a grave and beauty responsibility with it, because it also tells us that we decide right now, here and now, what will remain of and with us. Yeah. So if you're a mere materialist, the only question is what will remain of me, and that's enough to be busy. Yeah. But if you are even more than that, you know that you will take something with you. Yeah. And then reality begins. Yeah. Then the camera. Then there's no trial. We are in it right now. Yeah. And to some degree, that's, you can phrase this in a very complex way, but you can also bring it down to everyday life. Yeah. Question is, what do we send out? Yeah. So which signals do we send out to the world? Yeah. And there's one lesson my teacher, Viktor Frankl, gave to us, being a psychiatrist. He said, without TL in the back in the back of his mind. It didn't exist. Well, it wasn't in the textbooks then. Yeah, he said, in a very paradoxical way, what we send out remains with us. And what we receive doesn't belong to us, but to those who gave it to us. Yeah. Now, this sounds a bit paradoxical. It is, but if somebody is unfriendly to me, it is their or his or her unfriendliness. It doesn't belong to me. Yeah, it stays with them. And as we now know, it stays with them in a profound sense. Yeah. So, and if I'm friendly to someone, he or she may relish, being treated in a kind way, but it is my friendliness. It will remain with me. Yeah. And I think that's summing up a whole lot of wisdom teachings into everyday life here now. Yeah. To materialize it if you want. Yeah. We should actually. Yeah. I begin the book, or at least in the very first chapter, I think I quote Socrates, who had the most beautiful and heroic death, if you want, yeah, and agreed to his disciple asking, "How should we bury you?" And he says, "Never mind. If you can catch me, do it, but I won't be here." Yeah, and then he continues and say, "But if that is true," he says, "how important is it what we will take with us?" Yeah, and once again, that's what we send out remains with us. It's ours. Yeah, these are our traces in this world, yeah? And more than that, also in our soul. And that's, I think, a very encouraging message in a way, because it tells us nothing is lost. And it also brings, sometimes in the literature or on talks on such phenomena, we have it either here or there. In other words, either this life or the afterlife. But if there's eternity, welcome, it's happening right now. I mean, it's just a continuum. Yeah, there will be a break when we are going to die. It's going to be different, of course. Yeah, but still, there's a continuum, and we decide now a lot about what will be our life review and what will be with us, so to speak. I think that's very important, but it's also very meaningful. It means we count, we make a difference. Yeah. And sometimes my students, when we talk about meaning in psychology, they ask me, well, can you even talk about meaning? Look at this very wounded world, a very broken world. And I always tell them, you're right, but the fact that there's so much to be done means that you are needed. Your life has meaning. Otherwise, the alternative would be, it would be so great that we can only be grateful, which is also nice. I mean, but it's not much. I mean, but we are co-creators. We make a difference. Yeah. Not in the whole world, but in our world, in our family, in our circle of friends, in our neighborhoods, in our city, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And this is actually bringing, the subtitle of the book is on the border of life and death. Yeah. And I insisted to the publisher, life must be in the title, because this is where it's happening. Yeah. Then comes then, that's fine. But now is now. Yeah. And here we can co-create our heritage, if we want, and even our soul also.
Yeah. And I'm getting the sense that even though you knew these things before you studied terminal lucidity, that probably studying it has deepened your appreciation of the things that you've just been saying.
Yes, and many of the things I hoped were true in this, and logically they made sense, and these great arguments by Popper and Eccles and others. But it's very different when you have a case collection which is growing steadily, yeah, and you see one by one, it makes sense, it connects, connected, it makes sense. And of course, it's getting flesh, it's getting, it's getting alive. You see it, it stares you in the face, yeah, and that's a huge difference, of course, yeah.
It is huge. Do you have any hunch about why the numbers in terminal lucidity are relatively small? As you said, it's not rare. It's more like sort of like uncommon.
Yeah.
10%.
Yeah.
What do you think is happening in the other 90% of cases?
Like I said earlier, our textbooks are idealized cases. In reality, never, even if you throw dice, in the beginning, that you will see it doesn't. I don't know. and I'm not surprised. That's the point. Yeah. The thing is that it does happen. It's a bit like the near-death experience. There's this debate, or some, I wonder, is it that people don't have them? Is it that people don't remember them? Yeah. Which there's some likelihood of being the latter being the case. We don't know. Yeah. What I do know is that a number, not a few of my informants wrote to me and said, I nearly missed it. There was a traffic jam, and I thought, I won't make it. Let's turn around. Oh no! And then she still, and or other intervening circumstances, nearly. And TL is terminal lucidity is short. It can be 10, 15, 20 minutes. How easily does it happen that in a nursing home somebody lies there in his bed, for an hour, for a day, or not for a day, but half a day, and nobody enters the room, and maybe
it happened and nobody
maybe
saw
it happened and nobody's around.
Yeah.
And yes, truth be told, that's very important, because to everyone who's affected in the sense of he or she is a caregiver of somebody having dementia, and one is hoping for it. Yeah, it's fine to hope. It's important to know that it can happen, but don't expect it. Yeah, I sometimes receive emails from people who are sitting next to the patient, iPhone or phone in their hand, and they're making a video and they're waiting for his lucid episode, and it never comes, and that's very painful. Yeah, and I always tell people it's a gift, and you don't demand the gift. You can hope for it, but you don't demand it. Have your hands open when it happens, so that when it comes, you receive it, but don't expect it. And otherwise, why does it happen not in the rest, let's say 90 or 80%? I don't know, but we don't know precisely what's happening, in the sense of maybe there's a physiological trigger when we come close to death, which, there must be something also physically happening, because because we are, as long as we are embodied, if you want, we are one organism. So there's a clear relationship between mind and brain. And maybe there's a trigger, and that would also be clinically very relevant. Maybe we can use this trigger without the patient being close to death. Yeah. But so once we understand that TL seems to be death related, and death is a physical event, so therefore the cause or the trigger must also be at least partially physical, then you have the whole variety of disease. I mean, why do patients which have the exact same disease, let's say pancreatic cancer, at the same stage, why does one live on for 2 years beyond prognosis and the other dies 2 weeks after the diagnosis? We don't know. Their bodies are very chaotic, not in the sense of disorderly, but complex systems. Therefore, it's very hard to say why does it happen so in such a percentage of number of people, but it does happen. That is what counts. Yeah. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Well, one of the things when people ask me about near-death experiences and why only about 10 to 20% of people who survive a close brush with death report one, the other 80 to 90% don't, I tell them that based on research, we've tried to compare these two groups and we find no difference between them. And all I can say right now is heaven only knows. That maybe some other purposes or dynamics going on that certainly don't seem to be related to the physical world as far as we can tell. And so, so I give you that. If you like it, you could say heaven only knows.
That's very nice. I would use this phrase. It's very nice.
Well, I have a final comment I want to make, but before I do, is there anything else that you want to say that we haven't touched on so far in our interview?
Ooh, there's so much.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it was no. I think I'm fine with that. I mean, what I can say is that I said it in the beginning, that if people have questions or reports and don't know, I'm very willing. As I said, I made the promise to myself that answer every email I receive. It might take very long because once again, I've got 2 teenage daughters, 1 dog and a wonderful wife, and we travel a lot and I've got a lot of students, but still I find the time to, and I'm writing another book, but I still will find the time to answer. And not only a formal reply, I will try to get into what you're telling me. So you're not alone, and that's very important for a very long time. People who saw this, witnessed this, they were alone because nobody believed them. Yeah. I have a case in a monastery where there were nuns, and the former sister emerita, so the head of the monastery, had dementia, and then she had to come back. And even the nuns, when they told the priest should know something about souls. The priest said, yeah, but this is like a story, but it didn't happen. And then it happened again with another, and so on. So people were alone for a very long time. Yeah. And what I find even more interesting, not even more, but also very interesting, even medical doctors, once the term was there, terminal lucidity, it was like a license to finally come out and tell the story. They said, yes, I saw this so and so often. Yeah. Others didn't. That's also interesting. Why do some? But I think it also depends a little bit on the time one spends. I don't know, but the nurses tell us even more often because, of course, they have much more everyday contact. Yeah. And they also know their patients and they see that something different. And yeah. So, but now it's good to know that people know that they are not alone. Yeah. It's still overwhelming, and it combines 2, let's say, life-stressing events, namely the return of the patient and then the death of the patient. One of them said, I'm crying and laughing at the same time, smiling and crying at the same time. But that's life, no? Life is very ambivalent, and that's always both. And we have pain out of love, even if the love is a happy one. This is the complex beauty of life, and there's no use of putting order into something which is of a higher order, if you want. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, as this last little bit of our interview went, where you brought up that alone factor, which is so important, there's much more in your book, many more nuanced aspects of this that are discussed that we haven't touched on here. So I really want to encourage people to get your book. And my last comment is, I don't know whether you intended this, but for me, the title of your book has 2 meanings. It's not only about the threshold between life and death for people who are dying, but it's also the threshold for humanity between materialism and a post-materialist view that, about this essential self somehow existing. And that in a way, even your subtitle, about what is the subtitle exactly?
Terminal lucidity and the border of life and death.
The border of life and death. I think that humanity is on the border of kind of life and death based on our clinging to materialism, which enables a lot of the destructiveness that we see in the world, versus a post-materialist view that involves things like, the importance of what we do moment to moment in our interactions with each other, and the life and death of humanity is, I think, on the bordering
right
with that.
But may I just try, add a footnote to that? Yeah, I do have many materialist colleagues. Well, actually, I think most of them at university are materialists. Yeah, and we often smile at each other, knowing that we see the world very differently. But we also have some idealists. It's making a comeback. Yeah, and but I just want to say that I have full respect for them. Yeah. And when I share my work with them, they think I've gone off anyway, but still I do it properly at least, and it seems to make sense, but not their sense. But I just wanted to say, I mean, the question of goodness and badness, we are in the very wounded world, and the problem is we were the one who wounded it, yeah, and us along with it. But now what I would like to suggest that we separate. It's just a footnote. What you said was beautiful, but I just also wanted to point out that all of us have responsibility, no matter what we believe. And even those who are nihilists, in other words, they couldn't care less actually, maybe for them they don't, but at least for others they should. Yeah, and that would be the recipe for a perfect peace on earth, I think, but at least more peaceful, yeah, and a bit more caring and a bit more benevolence. I think benevolence is the point. I mean, that we wish for others that they are well, yeah, and this is something in a very competitive society. I mean, materialism has two meanings, at least in German it does. The one being a position on what the world consists of, and the other being consumerism, yeah. And I think consumerism is a huge problem because of course it tries to fulfill a need which is unfulfilled if you are materialist, but still people can. You don't need to change your outlook on life. You don't have to believe a word of what I'm saying. Anyway, you can test it. You can see the numbers and the figures, and there's some scientific articles also. But the need to be benevolent, that I think would be the point. Yeah, and whatever else you believe in the worth and value of another human being or of nature of others. Yeah, and then there would be at least a little bit of a difference. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that's a good note to end on. And this has just been such a pleasure, Alex. Really, thank you so much for your
me
time.
too.
And yeah, very good. And again, I just really want to encourage people to read your book. And it's even available as an audiobook. That's how I read it, by listening to it. And it was a wonderful experience. So.
It's well read, I must say. I also listened to it, and I had a totally new version of it. Utterly, the reader is excellent, I must say. Yeah.
Good.
So anyway,
you're happy with the narrator. That's important.
So much for advertising, but I didn't mean it like that. It's just a note of gratitude to the reader.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. It's been wonderful talking with you. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. You too.